Good afternoon. I'm here today to give you some data on some of the placement and disparity practices. So I'm going to lay out some information that really represents what we see as a problem in special education. Most of these slides that you'll see are graphs, but I'll talk around them. I'm not going to go through what that data specifically is. First, I want to talk about preschool children. Now, most of you who are parents or were parents of very young children may have had your child at home, may have had your child in a family daycare, or may have at some point before kindergarten set in, had your child go to a preschool setting. For parents who have children with disabilities who are identified during that time, there's a dilemma if you're 3 years old or even 4 years old, and there are no typical places that may accept your child. What happens is that what we see is a great disparity across states in the rate at which children with disabilities who are between the age of 3 and 5 access regular early childhood centers or early childhood programs. So you'll see here that if you're in Texas, you're very unlikely to have a preschool experience with non-disabled peers. You're very unlikely to be going to a typical preschool where you experience the regular preschool curriculum. On the other hand, if you go to Kentucky, you're very likely to have that opportunity. Now, there's no difference in the children between those states, but there's a huge difference in where you live and what you get access to. So this data shows preschool children who are attending regular early childhood centers and receiving their special ed services there. Huge disparity across states. What this slide shows you is, in those same states, those preschool-age children who are sent to a separate setting. So this data represents 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and 5-year-old children with disabilities who spend all of their time in a special ed-only environment. So if you're in Nevada, more than 50% of those children never experience an interaction in a structured setting with their non-disabled peers. In Alabama, only a few students are separated out. So again, a great disparity in the data. What I want to point out is that not only when we look at data, should we just look at students with disabilities, but in particular, if you look at subgroups by disability category, you'll see great differences. One of the huge discrepancies is experienced by children who have intellectual disabilities or were labeled as having mental retardation on their IEP. These preschool students are students with intellectual disabilities who are placed in regular education settings. So the kinds of differences you'll see is, for example, in Kentucky, where 81% of the children who are preschoolers attended a typical preschool setting. In Kentucky, children who are preschool age and were labeled as having mental retardation or intellectual disabilities, only 34% of them experienced an inclusive preschool option. In Maryland, the state I come from, only 53, only half of the children who are preschool age are included. But if you have an intellectual disability, only 24% are actually having that experience. So there's a huge discrepancy based on label. This is students with intellectual disabilities who are placed in separate facilities. So you can see, again, we saw Nevada with a very low number who are included. We see a large number who are placed with intellectual disabilities in separate settings. In Missouri, very few, 10% or less. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about school age data. Before I do that, I want to say why preschool is important. And one of the arguments we get from schools is that, well, there are very few typical 3-year-old or 4-year-old programs. We only operate 4-year-old programs for students who have of low socioeconomic status. However, what we know is that when we work with districts systemically to look at what are the services in your area, where do the children live, and what services do they need, districts can and do create fully inclusive options for their children. What they have to do is do it. They have to want to do it and then systematically do it. If we don't do that for our preschool children, we're catching parents at a very vulnerable time when they're looking to the schools for direction and support. And if they're told that their child must go to a special place to receive that special service that often translates up into the school age years. So what we see is great disparity at the school age level with access to non-disabled peers, participating in their neighborhood school, accessing the curriculum, and having a meaningful education. So here we have the school age students. These are children with disabilities across the board. And again, great disparities. Alabama is one of the most inclusive if you look at placement only. So this data, which is from the U.S. Department of Education, only tells us where the child is. It doesn't tell you about the quality of that service. So Alabama, North Dakota, Nebraska all have higher rates of inclusive placements than does New Jersey, Illinois, Washington State, and California. Again, disparities. This is the same state, students with intellectual disabilities. In Iowa, they include 60% or more of their children who have intellectual disabilities. Who are these students? These are children who may have a Down syndrome label, may have any variety of disability diagnoses for any reason, but they have been identified as having mental retardation or intellectual disability on their IEP. If we look at the difference in some states, well, this is students with intellectual disability. If I pull out a state like Arizona, they actually include 68% of their children with disabilities. But when you look at students with intellectual disabilities, they're down there on the bottom with 7.5% of their children with intellectual disabilities included. Great disparity. North Carolina, 62%, a little bit on the higher range compared to other states, all children included. But when you look at, again, students with intellectual disabilities, only 13%. I pulled out students with emotional disabilities. There's 3 categories of students who we see as more likely to be excluded than others. Students with intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, and autism. So students with emotional disabilities, if we look at them, I'm not going to go through state by state, but you'll see the great disparity. Hawaii, District of Columbia are least likely to include these students with emotional disabilities. North Dakota and Alabama are up high. The last thing I want to talk about is the racial disparities, and there's some really interesting data if you go to the U.S. Department of Education website. There are more students who are coded as Black or Latino who are excluded at a much higher rate than students who are coded as white. I'm going to give you some examples. If you see here on this slide, it shows the percentage of students with disabilities across states. So, in the country, there are 55, almost 56% of the children who attend public schools are white. About 20% are Black and 20% Latino. So theoretically, what we should see is when we look at a disability label, that percentage should be similar across. So when we look at students with intellectual disabilities, we would expect around 50% or 55% to be white, 20% Latino, 20% Black. But what we see is that, pulling out some states, in Maryland, where we have a higher number of Black students as compared to the national average, we have fewer students labeled as having intellectual disabilities and more Black students as labeled as having intellectual disabilities. Does that make sense? I'm going to go back. So what we would look at is, across the board, we look at that 20, and 56%. In Maryland, we have 44% of our population happens to be Black, 8% Hispanic, 45% are white. I'm going to flip now to students with intellectual disabilities. The average should be the same. So in Maryland, instead of 44, 8, and 45, we have 57, 6, and 33, meaning that more Black students are labeled as having intellectual disabilities, much fewer than average white students are. The other kinds of data we see have to do with the percentage of students who get diplomas. You would expect that 20, and 55. 68% of white students with disabilities get a diploma. 11% of Black students with disabilities get a diploma. 17% of Hispanic students with disabilities get a diploma. Students who are removed to an alternate setting for 10 or more days due to suspension, 1.5% of white students are removed. 5% of black students are removed. That's a tremendous difference. What we see if we look at the racial disparity data is, I think, a pattern of low expectations. I think prejudice in diagnosis, prejudice in removal. These students are often invisible to what the structure of our public school system is in terms of how they're looking at the student needs and the disability label. When I look at how states are labeling students, the white students are being identified as having an intellectual disability at a much lower rate, whereas they are getting a much higher rate of the label of autism. Black students are much more likely to have a disability label of intellectual disability and a much lower likelihood of getting a disability label of autism. You know, autism is sexy. In a lot of ways, you know, I know that parents are struggling when they have kids with autism, but if you have an autism label, you are often considered to have a promising intellectual abilities. You are not necessarily considered to have an intellectual disability or mental retardation. And so I think that what we see oftentimes is black students getting that MR, intellectual disability label, and not being considered as having autism. So what I want to leave you with is the notion that placement matters, and it is discriminate when it comes to students with intellectual disabilities, and especially if you're a black or Latino student. Thank you.